Hello, I'm Jonathan Carr-West. I'm Chief Executive of LGIU, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to the first in a series of conversations we're hosting, where we're going to be discussing first-hand experiences of local government reorganisation. Obviously, that's been a hot topic in English local government this year, following the publication of the devolution white paper at the end of last year. But we wanted to sort of get into what that really feels like. So we're going to be joined by chief executives, assistant chiefs, senior directors from councils that have reorganised recently to discuss their perspectives and what other people in the sector who are going through this process might want to know. So today, we're talking with Sam Plum, who's Chief Executive of Westmorland and Furness Council. Now, Sam has worked in local government since 2008. She started as Policy and Communities Manager at Pendle Borough Council before embarking on a 7-year career with Bradford Council, where she worked her way up to Assistant Director of Policy, Programmes and Change, and she was then at Rossendale for 2 years. She started her Cumbria journey with Barrow and Furness Borough Council as an exec director, and then for 3 years as chief executive. And in that role, she saw the council through the local government reorganisation process before joining the new Westmorland and Furness Shadow Authority as interim head of paid service, and finally the new authority as chief exec. So we're really excited to kick off this series by talking to Sam, because she's really been there, done that, and has that experience of local government reform. So we want to talk to her about what it takes to transform local government, what are the challenges that come from sort of dealing with these sort of competing proposals around reorganisation, and what sort of courage and humility do we need in local leadership right now to make that change a success. So Sam, welcome. And before we get into the kind of the nitty-gritty of reorganisation, I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and about your journey into local government. How did you begin?
Hi, Jonathan. Good to see you again. Yeah, so my journey goes back a little bit further than the bio. Actually, it's 33 years this year. I think local government service. So, and my first job was nothing to do with what I'm doing now. So it has been quite an interesting path. My first job in local government was as a countryside management officer in the Nen Valley for Northants County Council, which I started in 1992.
So that's a long way in every sense from where you
Yeah,
are now.
it really is. Kind of fell into more policy areas when I took up a job for Coventry City Council in local Agenda 21 days, not soon after the first UN summit on Agenda 21. And that took me into partnership world, working together, which led to local strategic partnerships, which led to regeneration, policy, change, and led me to where I am now, really. So probably worked in 8-ish local authorities up and down the country, nearly all, well, actually, I think all, with the exception of where I am now for Westmorland and Furness, have been relatively urban with some significant issues around social challenges, around deprivation, around cohesion, around worklessness. So everywhere I've worked has been one of those councils that's had the various funding streams over many years from SRB onwards. And so that's kind of driven my career and my kind of deep commitment really to being a public servant and to wanting to do the best for the residents that we're here to serve.
So you end up in Cumbria, initially at Barrow and Furness. And can you just tell us a bit about what your initial thoughts were when, I think you'd only been in the role about 6 months or so, when then Secretary of State Robert Jenrick invited proposals from Cumbria on unitarisation. What was your first reaction to that?
Yeah, it was. It was an interesting time. So I started in Cumbria in Barrow in May 2019. 10 months into post in March 2020, 5 years ago, we went into the first COVID lockdown and were hit by that huge global pandemic that we're all kind of still in some ways struggling with. And within, I think, whilst we were still well into in that kind of really intense COVID recovery stage, I think we got the invite to put in proposals in the September of that same year. So yeah, it was a tough time. I think local government in Cumbria was already working flat out because of what we were dealing with COVID, and it did feel, the timing felt odd to me at the time, if I'm really honest. It felt like it was another thing to layer on top of a really stretched and strained system. But local government always rises to the challenge and always does what's asked of us, no matter what it is. And we did grab it. I think in Cumbria, Cumbria, for those that don't know, at that time was a county council and 6 district councils, of which Barrow was one. The invitation came in the September. We had to get expressions of interest or outline business cases in by December, and we couldn't agree on a single model. The county council wanted a continuing county authority, and the 6 districts paired up and each came up with a separate proposal. So there were 4 competing bids for Cumbria. I think the assumption at the time was, when we put in those initial December bids, that they'd be whittled down and shortlisted in some way, but they weren't. Secretary of State said that all 4 met the criteria, and therefore all 4 needed to be worked up into full business cases, which we did by the end of February 2021, and then the final decision came in July 21.
As chief of one of the boroughs, how did you manage those sort of conflicting political priorities about how unitarisation should go, the different proposals on the scheme, people having very different ideas, evolving discussions with your counterparts in other boroughs and the county? What approach did you take to managing those conversations?
I think we were mature about it. I think we did talk to each other. We worked collectively together. I think there was a difference between the district councils and the county council, as there is in many places, and it wasn't always plain sailing. So I think the district chief execs met regularly anyway, so we carried on those networks. And even though we were working on different bids, we did try to support each other in that, because one of the things that we were asked to do, if you were putting in a proposal that didn't cover the whole of the county, you had to say what would happen in the other part of the county that you weren't focusing on. So we did all work together on that. I think the politicians, again, worked together. The district leaders worked together. So I think there was a split between district and county, and I'm sure that's playing out now in other parts of the country, and that's the nature of the world, unfortunately.
And I'm sure many people are asking your advice right now, because yes, across the country there are people in exactly this position, putting different proposals going forward, and I'm sure you'll say there's no kind of secret sauce or kind of magic ingredient to making that work. If you were advising people in the equivalent position now, maybe a district chief exec who's looking at this, what would you say that they needed to sort of hang on to and focus on in those conversations?
I think this is going to happen anyway, if this is the train that we're all on. And I think the priority for us as chief execs of place is to really think about what's best for place and not what's best for our individual organisations, and really put our residents and our businesses at the centre and forefront of our thinking, and thinking about what is the best model to deliver the things that we know we need to deliver for our place, regardless of our current organisations, because our current organisations are going to go, and we need to make sure that they're replaced with something that makes things better and not worse.
And as you transitioned in Cumbria from county plus districts to the new unitary structure, and Westmorland and Furness came into being as a shadow authority, were there changes in political control that went alongside that?
Yeah, there was. So in Westmorland and Furness, we had a Labour-controlled Borough Council, a Lib Dem-controlled South Lakes District Council, Lib Dem-controlled Eden, although that was a coalition, so there was no overall control, and no overall control County Council with a Labour Lib Dem administration and a Labour leader. So it was mixed for us. Cumberland, interestingly, all 3 districts were Conservative controlled, and then obviously county was Labour Lib Dem coalition. And we now have a very strong majority Lib Dem Westmorland and Furness, and a very strong majority Labour Cumberland.
And do you think the fact that all changed, did that help or hinder the process from your perspective as an officer, so trying to sort of stack up the kind of technicalities of the new unitaries. Did the political change get in the way, or was it helpful in that it was like, okay, everything's changing and it kind of underlines that?
I think it is, everything's changing, Jonathan. So I think for the other thing that I think it takes a while for it to really bubble up is that unitarisation creates a democratic deficit. So if you add together the number of seats for district councillors and county councillors across Westmorland and Furness, it was 160 something. I can't remember the exact number. I've got 65 councillors now covering the same area, covering all the same services, but with a lot less elected representation. And I do think that's a real issue for politicians. And I think it's taken a while for our politicians to try and get that balance between wanting to be really local, because most of my politicians, not all, but most of the 65 were existing either district or county or both before vesting day. So they're seasoned politicians, but trying to get the balance of wanting to be really local ward councillors, champions of place, getting involved in local issues, to some of the bigger strategic services and decisions that we're now responsible for, that unitary councillor role, I think, is really different. So we've worked with LGA and we've worked with others around that kind of support for our councillors to understand their role and to go through that process and to understand what it means to be responsible for a unitary council where you've got all those services in one place. Regardless of the political makeup of the council, we would have had to do that anyway. It has been a big reset.
And of course, even people coming from the counties have not been responsible necessarily for the things that the district councils were responsible for. So there's a except perhaps for the Twin Hatters, there's a learning curve for everyone.
Yeah.
There. And look, I think you're generally seen as having been a really successful example of this. So you delivered Westmorland and Furness, you delivered the reorganisation within budget, you achieved nearly 97% of the programme. What decisions did you make that sort of at the beginning, if you were sort of advising someone, what are the decisions you need to make right up top to make that a success? What are the things you look back and you think, God, I'm so glad that we did that because that really helped?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. I mean, I think we went quite early in appointing interim heads of paid service into the two new authorities. So we did that before the shadow elections, which were in May 22. So the shadow councillors were elected 11 months before vesting day. But I was appointed as interim head of paid service by the previous leaders, and then that was ratified at the first full council meeting after the election, so that I could be returning officer and actually run the elections, because that's quite an important thing to do with all of this. So I was interim head of paid service from April, May time the year before. They went early for the recruitment of the permanent. That was an open competition. It has to be open competition. And I secured that role in the July, but I was chief exec designate until the 31st of December. So for 6 months, I was doing the role, but not quite doing the role.
Yeah.
And I was head of paid service, but I didn't have a budget and I didn't have any staff and I didn't have any services. So it was an interesting place to be. But I, at that point, and Andrew did exactly the same in Cumberland, I freed myself up from Barrow, and they brought in an interim chief exec into Barrow to enable Barrow to close well. So I wasn't trying to do both jobs together. And I fully concentrated with a team around me, well, a small team around me, because everybody else was doing the day one readiness stuff. I concentrated for the best part of a year on setting up the new council and what would happen on day 2. So the programme that delivered everything that the programme needed to deliver was absolutely focused on day 1, safe and legal. Will this council have its lights on, empty the bins, fill the potholes, deliver care packages, support children from the 1st of April, no matter what? So almost nobody notices the difference. But my role and my focus was, well, what happens on day 2? And have we got what we need to keep running? So what happens? We don't want to fall over on day 2 or week 2 or month 2. So the work around the constitution, setting the first year budget, having a council plan that we could get behind, having an operating model so we were clear about how we were going to operate and what our priorities were as a unitary, starting to think about our values and our core messages, our branding. And actually, the biggest thing I think that we did that really made a difference was recruiting into the director and the assistant director posts, so that I had a full senior leadership team from day one, and everybody was clear about their role in the new organisation from day one. And I think that really helped.
Yes. So getting the team set up, getting the
Yeah.
team in place
Yeah.
early. And I think really important, your point there that safe and legal is, of course, it has to be safe and legal on day one, but that's like the bare minimum, right? That's the starting, but and actually you need to be thinking about what's beyond that. It's day 2, day 3, week 2, week 3, and so having that plan in place. Then did you talked about that, doing that role on a sort of acting basis, and then the recruitment process. How difficult was it as a decision for you to sort of put yourself forward for that, for chief at the new unitary authority?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very different role being chief exec of a unitary compared to being chief exec of a district. And I was relatively new into the chief exec at a district role, so I took that in May 2019, and that was my first chief exec role.
But that might be helpful as well, right? Because you weren't, you hadn't got 20 years of sort of embedded
Yeah,
this is how I do it.
I think what I'd learned, one of the things that struck me at Barrow from almost from day one, but definitely for that 18 months. And as we were dealing with COVID and other things, cost of living crisis and other things, I think some of the frustrations I had were around some of the county services. So children's services, some care services, but there's some real poverty deprivation issues in Barrow that I felt we weren't joined up as a system to try and tackle, and that was really frustrating me. So what drove me really, and this is my personal journey, I guess, what drove me to go for the chief exec job was being able to have those other levers and those other controls in the system, which I felt would enable me to unlock the real potential of this place and tackle some of those really long embedded problems that we've got in places like Barrow.
I think that's really interesting. And look, stop me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but what I'm hearing in all of your answers is a real focus. And I think this is really important because I think there's a risk in some places that we lose this, a real focus on outcomes, on what can this new authority deliver for communities, for residents? What would good look like? How do we make sure that this process enables an improvement in service delivery? And rather than, not just getting hung up on all the sort of structural and technical issues, that real laser focus on how do we make this really deliver for people?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I see myself through and through as a public servant. I am here to serve the people that pay my wages and to ensure that not just the services we deliver, but with our place leadership role and our system leadership role, that we are absolutely doing everything we can to improve our places, improve outcome for our residents. I want all of our children in our schools to come out with the very best attainment levels that they can achieve and go on to lead fulfilling lives. And that's what I want for my place. I want a fantastic environment. I mean, I've got half the Lake District and a bit of the Yorkshire Dales and a fantastic coastline. So it is a good start. But, I want that fantastic environment, and I really want a strong, thriving, diverse and inclusive community that enables us to grow and enables us to contribute to UK PLC. And I think my whole drive through that process and the constant message I was giving to staff through Q&A and all the rest of it is we're going through a lot of pain. There has to be gain at the end of this. This has to make things better. If we go through all this process and we don't shift health inequalities or educational attainment or working activity or all these other things that are all on our to-do list all the time, if this doesn't enable us to do that better, then what's the point? It's just moving furniture.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just shuffling, isn't it? I mean, two questions that arise from that for me is, so one, we'll talk about staff in a second, but one is about, there's a lot of focus on how you sort of bring together services from multiple districts. But I'm also really interested, one of the other challenges we are likely to have in many places is the disaggregation of, so going from a county with one children's services to, in your case, two unitaries with two sets of children's services, two children's services departments, two adult social care departments. in some areas that are looking at reorganisation now, we could be splitting from 1 into 3 or 4 or even 5. What particular challenges arose from that splitting?
The hardest part of the programme for Cumbria was separating a county council in two. It really was. In terms of what we had to do in the timescales that we were given, that is a huge amount of work, and don't underestimate how complicated that is. I mean, we did make a decision early on. We put a budget together, so we didn't get funding from government. I don't think the places now on the list are going to get funding from government, but we had to pay for this out of our own budgets, and it cost just shy of £19 million. And we split that cost between us, with the county taking half and the other half being split by the districts. And we made an early decision to bring in a strategic partner to walk alongside us, bring additional capacity when we needed it, bring expertise, bring programme management support when we needed it to enable us on that journey. And we wouldn't have done it if we hadn't done that, I don't think. But separating a county council when you've got over 8,000 staff who need to either be tupied into one I mean, it was easy for the district staff because they just tupied into the organisation on the footprint that they were. But for county, we had to make a decision and we had to go through a process that took a long time. We had 10,000 contracts that all needed novating into the two new authorities so that they were safe and legal. We had over 300 ICT systems and applications that needed separating. Data management around that is absolutely critical. So all of those things all take time.
Yeah.
And the county chief executive was interim. He really led that day one readiness programme because he knew his role was finishing and he'd come in as an interim knowing that. So he could really grab that and drive that programme. And me and Andrew acted as kind of senior responsible officers to support him, but we were focusing on day two and he was focusing on day one, and it worked really well in that way. But it is tough, and we didn't do it all by day one. I think that's the other thing. We made some fairly early decisions that we cannot separate a whole county safely and legally by the 1st of April 2023. Right. So what are the things that we need to give ourselves more time to do? What are the things where actually it doesn't make any sense to separate them and we might host them in one or other council long term? And what are the things that we just can't do it now, but we'll be able to do it fairly early on? And I think we had 34-ish services. Westmorland and Furness hosted some and provided that service to Cumberland through a kind of service level agreement, interagency agreement, and vice versa. Cumberland did that for us. And then we've been going through a process through a joint exec committee and a joint officer board of disaggregating those services over the last 2 years. And we're 2/3 of the way through that. We've still got about 11 or 12 to do next year.
So again, real clarity of who does what, who's responsible for what, and what time frames, what needs doing at what point, and what you So look, that you've described really compellingly, and I think for people going through this, it was going to be hugely useful. But you've described some of the complexities of the process. You talked a bit earlier about talking to staff and saying, look, we've recognized, this is painful. We're going through this. I mean, it's a sort of crude question. How painful was it? Because these are people's jobs, their livelihoods, it must have been very stressful for people to deliver this whilst also worrying about their own kind of position. And how did you hold that as a leader?
It was. I think people were worried. Any change is unsettling, isn't it? And it can make people, as well as kind of seeing it as an opportunity and something to embrace, also people feel anxious and worried about their future. And we've all managed change programs in the past, but this is like wholesale change. It happens in local government once every 50 years. Do you know what I mean? In the NHS, maybe a little more
often, perhaps.
So I think it's that constant comms. I mean, early on, right from the get-go, we said comms, engagement with staff, regular messaging, regular open Q&A sessions, getting out into buildings, sitting down and listening has to be absolutely written through everything that we do, and we were really clear about that, and we did put additional resource into that comms right from the start, and it was ongoing. And then once me and Andrew knew that we were going to be the future, we stepped into that leadership role much more clearly. Now with district staff, again, it was easier to do because they knew where they were going to end up. With county, it was we did a lot of things together, joint things together, but also I think the other thing was that everybody tupied in to the new organisation on the same terms and conditions and the same job description, doing the same work. and there was no change. And for most staff in most roles, still 2 years in, they're still doing exactly the same thing as they were doing before vesting day. So if you were a planner, if you're an environmental health officer, if you're a care worker in one of our care homes, if you're a social worker, whatever, you're still doing what you always did. You're still actually on the same pay and grading in the same terms, and this because you've TUPE'd in. And until we do full restructures, you're still on exactly the same conditions, doing exactly the same work. So our biggest reassuring message was keep doing what you've always done until somebody tells you to stop. And for most people, we haven't said stop yet.
Now, how did you decide, as a leader, how do you decide how much of your time to be spending on that comms piece, on that conversation, on the listening and talking, and how much of it on the, in the weeds of the sort of contractual stuff? I mean, there's so many competing demands on your time. How did you kind of make decisions about that, about the best use of you as a resource?
I mean, so there was the three stat officers, so head of paid service, monitoring officer, section 151 officer. We that golden triangle, we had to be in post in interim as well as from day one. So I did have interim chief finance officer and monitoring officer alongside, and they did change as we went through the recruitment process. But that was really key. And then how we divvied up our time and what we've all focused on. So monitoring officer focused on constitution, 151 focused on budget, I focused on council plan, culture and operating model. So that helped us think about where we needed to be and where we needed to be visible. The day one readiness stuff, I did leave that to the district and the county, and I had to trust and step away from that because I couldn't do everything. And then being visible, I think, was really, really important.
So, you've talked a lot about, how carefully you planned all this, but there must have been some things that you didn't expect. There must have been some challenges or obstacles or difficulties that you hadn't thought about. Can you tell us a bit about those?
Yeah, there probably were, but I've probably blocked them out, Jonathan. No, I mean, there was always curveballs and things that we weren't expecting, I guess. The program management was phenomenal, and the work around that. There was a weekly day one readiness board. There was work streams. There was everything going on. I had a weekly work stream looking at the future. There was really random weird stuff. Like we suddenly realised that as we'd drawn a line on the map and cut Cumbria in half, there were about 21. This is just a little anecdote. There were 21 bridges that bridged a river that was now the boundary between Westmorland and Furness and Cumberland. And so which highways department was going to take on the maintenance of that bridge? And we had to sort it out because if we hadn't sorted it out, it would have tripped us up.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of things like that, and small little things, but they created a lot of noise at the time until we got them sorted. And we'd spend an inordinate amount of time talking about small contracts and things like that did really need us, me and Andrew, to get in a room and say, right, okay, which way are we going to cut this, and just making the decision. So I think that, the ability for me and Andrew and we got on so well and worked together so well, but the ability for us, I think we both had each other on speed dial for 12 months to make quick decisions on things like that, just to get things moving. And so far, I don't think anything has come back to really bite us, but you never know. It might just not have surfaced yet, Jonathan.
There's always banana skins out there somewhere. I guess sort of related to that, is there anything that you know now, having sort of gone through that journey, are there things you know now that you wish you'd known at the beginning?
So I think separating out a county ICT service into two new unitaries is incredibly complex, incredibly expensive and difficult and full of risk. And we haven't done it yet. And it's one of the hosted services programs that's still working through. And I think if I'd known then what I know now, I think we would have worked harder at a potentially different solution rather than separating and actually spending some serious money up front to buy what we needed and implement it in a different way rather than trying to split what we've got, rather than replacing. I think the ICT is a huge issue we're still, it's some of the basic stuff that staff talk about, that we haven't been able to integrate all the systems together, so we've got different licenses. So where in old money, you could just talk to team members. Now you've got team members who are from 3 or 4 different organisations, and it doesn't quite work. And we'll get there. It's all fixable. But I think if we'd known 2 years ago how long it'd take to run that programme and had real clarity on the impact that that would have, we might have done something different. We might not have been able to do anything different. I think we would have had different conversations. And I would urge anyone going through this, if you are going to be in a situation where the county is going to be split, however way it's split, then some of those big county infrastructure, internal infrastructure systems, payroll. So we've still got 4 payroll. Because we tupied everybody and everybody's on the same terms and conditions, I think we had at least three, if not 4 different pay dates in a month. And so we've had to keep the payroll. So we've had to work with HMRC on PAYE and all the legal stuff around that. But we are going to have, from the 1st of April, I'm touching wood, we are going to have 1 payroll system for Westmorland and Furness and 1 payroll system for Cumbria, but it's taken 2 years to do. And it's that back office enabler, corporate support stuff that we probably don't pay enough attention to. And it's probably the bits of all of our organisations, wherever you are in the country, that have been hit hardest by austerity, because every council in the country has done everything that it can politically over the last 15 years to protect frontline services. And the result of that is that our enabling and corporate enabling services are cut to the bone. And then to ask them to step up and do huge transformational change is a massive ask.
One of the things that strikes me when I look at and talk to people who are sort of starting on this journey now is I think there's been a remarkable amount of sort of pragmatism in the sector, a remarkable amount of people, really sort of not kind of being like, oh no, I don't want change. Yes, okay, change is happening. How do we make it work? But we also know, and our finance survey comes out today, and it reveals people are anxious about the time frames. People are anxious about whether it's actually going to save any money in the end, and people are anxious about the process. Is there any other kind of words of advice or comfort or warning that you would share with colleagues who are sort of perhaps who want this to work and are committed to making it work, but are understandably have some trepidation about it?
Yeah. Well, it's worth it. It is worth it. It's tough. It is really tough. It's probably the hardest programme that I've ever been involved in my working life. I think personally for the chief execs, the senior leadership team, but those 3 stat officers going through that process, it's tough. I mean, you do know at the start of it that there's only going to be 1 chief exec, 1 monitoring officer, 1 officer in the new councils, and everybody knows how many there are in the system at the moment, and you've just got to be really honest about that. So there's a personal jeopardy, but I think but it's tough. The hours were ridiculous for that 12 months, but it is worth it. So I've already said that one of my drivers going for the job was children's services. County council had been requires improvement for several years. We knew that the Ofsted had come in within the first 2 years, because they always do after LGR, because they are worried that the big system kind of upheaval can take your eye off the ball in terms of your improvement plans, and things can potentially go backwards. They gave us a ring. We got the call the 2nd week in April at the start of year 2, which I did think was a little bit mean, but we got good. We got good. And just over 12 months, going through all that upheaval, shifting the system dramatically, bringing in a new DCS, who is brilliant. We got good. And we are now, outcomes for our children are better than they were. We've just had our SEND inspection, and the report isn't out yet. But when I went to the informal feedback, the first line that the inspector read out was, things have got better since LGR. So that I'll take that. I'll take that every day of the week. And that's what I did it for. So yeah, absolutely no regrets. No regrets.
Sam Plum, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Jonathan.